Thank you, Jennifer, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me back to EDA. Always wonderful. Leanne, how many years is this now? 9? I don't know. I've lost count. It is, and I say this every year, so you're going to think, oh, he always says that. But it really is great to be here. This is a highlight of spring for me. Usually when it's EDA, it's like, it's going to snow, but hopefully it'll be one of the last snows we see of the year. So great to be back with you. My only regret, however, is that I was unable to be with you last night, which is a first for me, actually missing the minister's dinner and the dinner last night. And as Jennifer politely put it, I said, and what do they call that drinking party? The hospitality suite is the polite way of saying that. So I was disappointed to miss all of that because it's always so much fun with you. So many familiar faces, so many people I've gotten to know as very good friends in EDA over the years, and always the chance to meet new friends. So I missed out on a little bit of that last night, but nice to be with you briefly here this morning. The title of the presentation I have for you this year, Alberta's Economic Outlook 2018, 5 Trends to Watch. I think it's important for us here in Alberta, now that we are well into 2018, in fact, we're almost finished the first quarter here. But now that we're well into the year, I think it's important for Albertans to intentionally recalibrate and reframe our language away from talking about recession, and instead reorient our language and our frame of mind towards growth. And what I mean by this is when we look back at the recession of 2015 and 2016, and my job as an economist, I spend a lot of time tracking these indicators that come out every day and every week. Indicators that would suggest if Alberta's economy is in recession or growing. And when I track all of those and I look back over the last 4 or 5 years, the recession of 2015 and 2016, it was indeed about the worst kick to the head of this poor province in 30 years. But statistically, the very bottom or the trough of the recession took place right around June or July of 2016. And everyone will remember the summer of 2016, right? Bryan Adams, he might have sung about the summer of '69. No one wrote a song about the summer of 2016, unless it was one of those really miserably sad country western songs, because it was a terrible summer for Alberta. It kicked off in May. We all remember the forest fires and the devastation in Fort McMurray, which was followed by June and July, statistically the 2 worst months for Alberta's economy, by most of the ways we would measure it. Certainly the unemployment rate peaked in July of 2016, cresting above 10% in Calgary and near 10% in the rest of the province. Housing prices, retail sales, manufacturing, all of the big indicators that we would look at that gauge how well an economy is doing, they all reached a bottom right around the summer of 2016. But from that point, then they started to improve. And since then, we have seen steady, gradual, but steady improvements. And when we think about June of 2016, that is now almost 2 years ago. So we need to recalibrate our language and our frame of mind away from recession mentality and orient it towards growth. Now, I also want to be clear, I do not for a minute suggest that everything is roses and sunshine, because it is not. It is still a difficult economy. There are still businesses that are in serious trouble. The unemployment rate in Alberta is still too high, hovering around 7%. And there's thousands of Albertans who are still suffering, either because of unemployment or maybe underemployment, and nervous about what's going to happen next. So I don't want to suggest that everything is great, but we are not in recession. The economy is moving towards where it is growing and improving. And I think it's helpful, especially as economic developers, I think it's helpful that we are purposeful and stop living recession mentality and rather recognize the challenges and the difficulties, but recognize that our economy is again growing. This morning I want to touch on 5 themes or trends that I think will mark Alberta's economy this year. Before we get there, I want to spend a little bit of time, as I always do, talking about what's happening outside of our provincial borders. Because we know in Alberta we are very much influenced by what takes place elsewhere. So let's start then with just a couple of comments about the global economy. 2017 was actually a remarkable year for the global economy because we saw something a bit unusual, and that is synchronized growth around the major economic blocs. Asia, North America, and Europe. All three of them, we saw economic growth, and not only that, but growth was accelerating throughout the year. Very unusual, actually, that you see that. Normally, you would see one or maybe two of those economic regions either slowing down or maybe an outright recession. Very rare you see all three of them picking up speed at the same time. That is what we did see in 2017. You had to look pretty hard around the global economy to find any major country or major economy that was in fact suffering in recession. Even those that had been mired in recession for a long time, Southern Europe, like Greece and Italy and Spain, or Russia or Brazil, even those countries were now again growing, maybe a little bit slower than what we'd hope, but they were all moving in the right direction. And that global economic growth has led or has continued into 2018. But at the moment in 2018, I would also suggest there is a growing sense of fragility around the global economy. We didn't really see any kinds of, cracks in the economy in 2017, but in 2018, there's some signs or maybe signals that people are a bit anxious about what, in fact, might happen next. And when you look around the world, on balance, there's some reasons to be a bit concerned. You've got some countries of the world with, how do you want to say it, questionable leadership at the moment. You've got North Korea pointing sharp objects at other people. You've got all kinds of crazy things really going on that could very easily derail the global economic growth that we're seeing at the moment. Even the trade spat announced yesterday between the United States and China, the trade war. This could be one more thing. The stock markets took a big hit. The U.S. stock markets took a big hit yesterday. But it's one more thing that could, just cause investors to say, that's it for the global economy, I'm pulling out or, running and ducking for cover. And then you can start to see a snowball effect and some sort of financial crisis. Now I want to be clear, it's not my prediction that we are going to see some financial crisis or geopolitical crisis in 2018. But I think the probabilities of that are growing, and I think we can't discount the possibilities that we might see some major event derail everything in 2018. For now, however, we're not seeing that. For now, the global economy still appears to be in good shape. We just have to be mindful that we can't take anything for granted with what goes on globally. And here in Canada, we also saw a really good year nationally in 2017. Canada's GDP growth rate probably clocking in around 3% last year. Stats Canada hasn't quite tabulated the final official number, but 3% real GDP growth rate last year, that's almost double what economists were predicting at the beginning of 2017. On average, we were expecting growth about 1.7%, but it turned out 2017 was a much better year for Canada than we had expected at the beginning. The problem is a lot of that growth was led by consumer spending and consumer debt, and a lot of it was being propped up by that still galloping away housing market in Toronto and Vancouver. And everyone, you don't need to be a Nobel laureate in economics to understand this is not going to last. This high level of consumer debt, housing markets that are bubbly and frothy. So 2018, we are expecting some slowdown in the Canadian economy. However, the Bank of Canada, they responded with some rate increases to the growth we saw last year. We've seen 3 rate increases from the Bank of Canada in the last 8 months or so. In March, a couple of weeks ago, at the most recent fixed announcement date of the Bank of Canada, they said basically, well, we're not raising rates today and we're a little nervous about everything that could happen to derail Canada's economy this year. We're tossing and turning about NAFTA, and we're just, worried spitless about what could happen in Toronto and Vancouver and all of these, things that could go wrong. So the Bank of Canada, they didn't raise rates in March, and they've taken on quite a dovish tone. Now this morning, this is how quickly things can happen. This morning, the inflation report out actually showed inflation's now picking up in Canada, which could give the Bank of Canada reason to maybe reassess their dovish position. So when we're going to see another rate increase from the Bank of Canada, it's hard to guess. Before this morning, I would have said we're not going to see a rate increase until fall of this year. And then we'll probably see 2 by the end of this year. But this morning's inflation report, now everything changes again, and the Bank of Canada, in fact, could move up their next rate increase to maybe late spring or early summer. Whatever the timing, I mean, it's impossible to predict the timing of this, but barring any sort of major economic calamity in the global economy this year, I do think we will see 2 more rate increases from the Bank of Canada, probably back-ended or towards the second half or towards the end of the year. All right, enough about that. Let's now turn to Alberta and talk about what's happening in this province, because obviously I think you and your members are going to be most interested in what's going on in our province. As I said, I want to talk about 5 trends or overarching themes that I think will mark Alberta's economy this year. And then I'll end with our forecast where we at ATB Financial, my economics team, where we see economic growth rates in 2018 and going beyond. So what are these 5 big themes this year? Well, the first one, we got to talk about pipelines. Now, probably everyone's sick to death about talking about pipelines, and this is not a new issue. This is not just something that's come up. This has been ongoing already for how many years? But I think 2018, we could see some sort of climax in terms of the talk around pipelines. And obviously, it's heating up. Pipeline debate, it's no longer anything to do with economics or the financial feasibility of them. It's all politics all the time. The 3 pipeline projects that are still being moved forward, the Keystone XL pipeline, the Line 3 expansion, or replacement rather, and then the one that's at the center of a lot of controversy lately, the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline. Maybe you've heard about this one. This is, in the news full time. And we're in this really interesting situation. And I'm not a political analyst, so I can't really comment intelligently on what's going to happen. But we've got this fascinating political, at loggerheads, the governments of Alberta and British Columbia, bitterly on different sides of this project. And then you've got Ottawa sort of being dragged kicking and screaming into the fray, being forced to kind of pick a side and take some action on that. So you've got 3 governments, and they're all trying to weigh, how do we play this out? And because it's all politics all the time, the economics of it aren't really a big factor. It's how these governments are going to play this and maneuver this politically. So I'm just as fascinated as everybody else in how politically this is going to play out in 2018. Like I said, I'm not a political analyst or expert, so I can't offer any suggestions. But I would say, and no one in the room here needs any convincing on this. For one thing, I'm not convinced everyone in Alberta is unanimous on the pipelines. There's probably some Albertans who would maybe side with the people in Burnaby and say, we don't need any more pipelines. However, I do think by and large, the vast majority of Albertans understand very clearly what's at stake here. And what's at stake is not just the future of Alberta's energy industry, although they would feel it most immediately if in fact these pipeline projects don't proceed. But what's really at stake is the future of Canada's economic prosperity. It's no longer just an Alberta energy thing. The reason why it's Canada's problem is because if these pipeline projects do not go ahead, it sends a message to international investors that we do not have our act together here in Canada, that we as a country can't even organize ourselves and agree on something in the grand scheme of global projects, something as simple as a pipeline from Edmonton to Burnaby, and do it safely and do it in a way that is respectful of the environment. But it sends a message to international investors. They just don't know what they're doing. They don't have their act together if they can't even agree on this. And international capital and finance that doesn't have any sort of warm, fuzzy, patriotic feelings about Canada. We just say, well, you guys you don't have your act together, we're going to invest elsewhere. And that's why I don't think this is just an Alberta energy industry problem. It is a bigger problem for Canada. It's one I'm very concerned about. We'll have to see how this all plays out. I am on pins and needles like everybody else, but we'll have to hope for a positive outcome in 2018. But that's the first theme. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about pipelines in 2018. All right. The second theme that I want to talk about is high levels of household debt and what this is going to mean for some of those consumer-oriented sectors like retail, like the housing market, like the restaurant and bar industries, all of those things that depend on consumer spending and maybe on consumer borrowing. Well, we are at a record level of household debt. That's not new either. Even back in 2014, we were at a record level of household debt here in Alberta and nationally. The problem is it's just continued to grow every quarter since 2014. But back in 2014, if someone would have asked me, should we be worried or panicking about this record level of debt? I would have said back in 2014, well, you never want the words debt and record level in the same sentence. Like nothing good can come of this. So there is some concern for sure about that. But I would have said back in 2014, we don't need to be panicking about this because even though debt levels are at a record high, debt servicing costs for most households in Alberta were lower than they were 10 years previous. And that is because obviously interest rates were at a record low. And I would have said back in 2014, the Bank of Canada is nowhere close to even start talking about raising interest rates. So those households that perhaps have taken on far too much debt, they have some time ahead of them in which to get their debt situation in order. So I would have said it's a concern, but we don't need to be panicking about this. Now, fast forward to March 2018, and time has kind of run out for some of those households and individuals that perhaps have taken on far too much debt. Because as we've already noted, we've seen 3 rate increases from the Bank of Canada, and likely more to come later this year. Not sure when, but interest rates are now starting to rise, and debt levels are even higher. So unfortunately, and it brings me no joy in talking about this as a trend, but I do think we will see a rising level of consumer insolvencies in this province this year. That's the unfortunate reality. If you follow the OWL, which I'll talk about at the end, yesterday, in fact, I wrote about consumer bankruptcies in Alberta, but also consumer proposals, which if you know finance world, this is what you do at the lender or at the creditor. When you're out of options, it's basically the precursor before bankruptcy. Bankruptcies have been relatively stable, but proposals have continued to rise through 2016, 17, and now into 2018. So I do think we will start to see rising levels of consumer insolvencies, and that will have some negative ripple effect, I think, on those consumer-driven sectors like retail and maybe housing. But I also want to be clear, it's easy to sort of exaggerate how bad this is. It's when we talk about record level of debt, it's sort of tempting to conclude that every one of us has borrowed recklessly and irresponsibly, and we've all charged up the maximum on our credit cards, and we're all going down with the ship. Well, that's the farthest really from the truth. In fact, the vast majority of Albertans, even if they've taken on more debt individually, the vast majority of Albertans are not going to be in trouble or at risk of default. However, it's that minority that perhaps are going to be in trouble, and that minority is starting to grow. So it is going to be a trend, I think, this year, a negative trend. We'll have to watch and see how this all plays out, but I think we will see rising levels of consumer insolvencies this year. All right. Enough of the bad news. Let's talk about even worse news and talk about... Actually, there's some good news on this, but let's talk about Canada and Alberta's position with respect to global trade and international trade. These days, when we're talking about trade, it's all sort of focused on NAFTA and how these negotiations between Canada, US, and Mexico, how this is all going to play out. A lot of moving parts in this. Well, I will tell you precisely how the NAFTA negotiations will play out. If you can tell me precisely what Donald Trump is going to tweet out this afternoon, because we just don't know with this guy. And love him or hate him, he has a very interesting management and leadership style, and that is to just kind of say random things all the time. And this is the world we live in, and I actually, and I'm half serious about this, I can't quite decide if he really is just a a buffoon or if there really is some method to this madness, because what he's doing by sending out all these contradictory and unprepared and unplanned tweets at any given hour of the day, it's got to be really difficult for his negotiating opponents, Canada and Mexico, to put together any kind of sensible strategy in the negotiations. And I'm not a professional negotiator, but the way I would think it would go is that you've got your strategy. How are we going to attack this? Or how are we going to, show up at the next negotiating round? And what's going to be our strategy in dealing with this? But if the White House and Donald Trump, they're saying all these contradictory things and random kind of thoughts, this has got to be really off-putting for a negotiating team, because then you're always scrambling and going back, and it's like, oh no, now China, trade war with China, and this changes everything again. So it really puts Canada and I think Mexico in an awkward negotiating spot, not a position of strength, I would note. Now, the NAFTA negotiations, or the NAFTA agreement, the world's largest and most successful trade agreement of all time, has been unquestionably good for the U.S. economy. You wouldn't find an economist to say otherwise. Now, there are certain sectors in the U.S. that, there's been maybe some struggle, but overall, it's been a benefit to the U.S. However, it's been even better for Canada and Mexico, and the White House knows this. And that weakens our position as well. So I actually can't tell you how the NAFTA negotiations are going to wrap up, but there is obviously a lot at stake. Now, more positive news, never mind NAFTA, in the midst of all this NAFTA madness, we tend to forget that we have a freshly signed trade agreement with the European Union, which, when you consider all 27 member countries of the EU, is a larger trade bloc than the United States. And we've got free trade access now to them, by and large, or a few things that need to be still ratified, but basically this opens up a whole new level of opportunity for Canadian exporters. The problem is we're going to have to do the heavy lifting and the hard work to get into those markets. Yeah, we've got maybe better trade access, but it's more work for Canadian companies and industries to build those trade relationships with new countries, new to us, or maybe new trade partners. There are cultural and language differences. There's differences in business culture. There's time zone changes. All of this makes it more difficult to do business with Europeans, but not impossible. It's been much easier over the last 151 years for us to do business with the United States because by and large everything's the same, same language, same business practices, business culture, time zones, it's all basically the same. Europe, it's harder work, but I do think there are lots of opportunities if we want to do the heavy lifting and get into those markets, especially around Canadian agriculture and agri-foods. So I think there's lots of really positive opportunities. I'm hoping to see new opportunities opening up and new trade corridors and trade linkages in 2018. But then there's also the other side of the Pacific, or the other ocean, crossing the Pacific, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, here we've got 11 countries. We remember that, of course, there used to be 12 with the United States. Pardon me, talk among yourselves. That's better. We've got originally 12 member countries, but the United States pulled out of it. And when the U.S. pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it left the other 11 countries kind of awkwardly shuffling around, wondering what to do precisely. It's a little reminiscent, and some of you might remember, back in high school, the high school dances in the gym, and everyone's sort of awkwardly standing there, and no one knows precisely what to do. And the person everyone came to dance with has just now left the room and gone home, wondering, well, what are we doing here? Should we even stick around? Because, of course, everyone wanted access to the United States. No one was participating in this to get free trade with New Zealand or the Philippines. It was all, the U.S. was the jewel in the crown here for those other 11 countries, Canada already having that access. But after the U.S. left, the other 11 countries were kind of left, sort of wandering around, wondering what to do. It came to Japan and Canada, basically, that said, no, come on, guys, we can still do this. There's still advantages with the remaining 11 countries liberalizing a trade agreement. The problem with these big multinational trade agreements, or multilateral trade agreements, is that when you get 11 very different countries in the same room, they can all arrive at the meetings high-minded about the benefits of free trade, but then the negotiations start, and every country, including Canada, puts up their hand and says, oh, but we need a special exemption over here for this industry. Or, oh yeah, this industry, it needs some protection. So, and then once everyone does this, notoriously these big multilateral agreements tend to kind of derail. I don't know where the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going. There seems to be renewed interest in getting it or recharging it. But if it doesn't really go anywhere in 2018, I think Canada really should take Japan aside and say, all right, we need a bilateral trade agreement, Canada, Japan, let's do this. I think Japan is an overlooked country in 2018. It seems a little bit lost in all the madness with the global economy and Donald Trump and China and Brexit and all these things going on. We tend to forget Japan is still the world's third largest nation economy, after the US and China. Now, Europe as a bloc is larger, but as a standalone country, Japan is a very large economy. It's not a fast-growing economy, and its population is, in fact, sliding a little bit. But it's a very large economy, and Canada has such a very small market share in that big economy. It is a liberal democracy with rule of law and a court system similar to ours, business practices similar to ours. It's easier than perhaps doing business in China, where you kind of expose yourself to questions about human rights and all kinds of different things. Japan is a very similar country. I think there'd be huge opportunities, especially, again, for agriculture and agri-foods to get into the Japanese market. And if BC refuses to allow us to have a pipeline for bitumen, we'll fill it full of organic honey, and we'll ship honey to the Japanese. But if it's NAFTA, if it's the trade with the European Union, or if it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think 2018, we're going to be hearing a lot about Canada and Alberta's global trade affairs. All right, the fourth theme I want to talk about, and you might have been wondering, how long is he going to talk about the economy without talking about energy or oil? Well, here it is, theme number 4, oil prices. If anyone in the room needs a reminder how dependent this province is still on the energy sector, all we need to do is rewind to June of 2014. We all remember what happened. At the time, West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. benchmark price at $107 U.S. a barrel, everything in Alberta was going along quite nicely. And then that price started to collapse, landing in a heap around January of 2016, at somewhere under $30 a barrel. And that single economic factor, that was the only economic change that took place over that time, that in fact threw Alberta into 2 years of spiraling recession. There really were no other economic negatives at the time. Agriculture prices were very stable. The Canadian dollar was softening, which on balance should be a benefit. So there are other things going on were either neutral or helpful. It was the single collapse in oil prices that threw Alberta into recession. Now, since January of 16, we have seen that West Texas price, the U.S. benchmark price, we have seen it on an encouraging kind of rebound. These days, above $60, $65 a barrel U.S. And that has been encouraging, but I think it's led to perhaps a false sense of encouragement in this province. Because most every Albertan, when we're driving around and we listen to the radio, we hear, the business report, West Texas Intermediate is at $65 a barrel, it's at a 4-year high, and we tend to think, oh, what a relief, maybe we're back on track. Well, it is encouraging that WTI has recovered. The problem is, and you probably are very aware of this, the Western Canadian price has not really rebounded much at all. It's been notably flat. And it's been flat because, this gets back to theme number 1, of pipeline constraints. We don't have enough capacity to be moving it out, especially the bitumen and the heavy oils. So as a result, that heavy oil has tended to back up into Alberta. The oil sands are still producing them, but there's a lot of supply. We can't really get it out. And that has resulted in a flat oil price environment for producers in Alberta. So where's the energy sector at in 2018? Well, I would describe it, and I've used this metaphor before, so you might have heard this, but I think the energy sector in Alberta has taken on a new role. Prior to the oil price downturn, I would have described the energy sector as the engine of Alberta's economy. It was driving everything forward. It was driving employment forward, wages. Wages outside the energy sector were being lifted in the wake of this. It was driving construction, engineering, foreign capital coming into the province. Everything was being driven forward by this engine of growth, the energy sector. Then prices collapsed. We went through 2 years of recalibrating and recession. Coming out of it, the energy sector in Alberta, I would describe as no longer an engine, rather it's a backbone. Now, a backbone is also very important. I don't know if any of you suffer back pain. If you're too young to, you just wait. You will eventually, and you will know how important it is that your back and your column and your spine are in good shape. Because if they're not, back pain is, you can't even really move around. So you want to take care of your backbone and your spine. We want to take care of our energy industry. It's vastly important, but it's not the engine of growth, not in the same way it was. The growth in the province is now coming from other industries and other sectors, which we'll maybe talk about in a moment or two. And that is helping to diversify Alberta's economy. This is going to take probably a decade or longer, but an engine of growth, now a backbone for Alberta's economy, other things taking up the mantle of growth in the province. That's how I would describe the energy sector. Prices this year, we're not expecting that Western Canadian price. We're not expecting much more of a lift. That means the energy sector is going to have to remain laser focused on cost containment and probably not a lot of growth coming out of that sector this year. All right, so the fifth and final theme that I want to talk about has to do with the labor market. And I apologize, this picture is a little upsetting. I didn't really intend for it to be that jarring. But I want to talk about the labor market, especially with respect to artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation. Because I think there is a growing level of anxiety these days. And this, of course, is not limited to Alberta. Everywhere in the modern economy, in the global economy, they're dealing with this. But there is a growing sense of worry about, are we all going to be replaced by robots? And what does this mean? We're all going to be unemployed soon. The Conference Board of Canada, some of you might remember a report that came out in the fall of last year. Conference Board suggested that up to 40% of jobs in Canada will be affected by automation by the year 2030. Not 2130, but in 12 years, 40% of Canadian workers will be affected by automation. Now that is a headline-grabbing, or an eyeball-grabbing headline, 40%, 4 in 10 workers. Well, a couple of things. I think it's important to note they use the word affected, not eliminated. Affected can be good. And probably a lot of you are seeing this in lots of industries. You bring some automation or a robot alongside, and suddenly that worker is much more productive, much more efficient, maybe even happier because a lot of the grunt work can be done by the robot. And this is what economists like to see, is more efficiency, more productivity out of all workers. That's the way an economy grows. So it can actually be positive, but you can also see, without too much of a stretch of imagination here, how some of this will result in displacement of workers. What used to take 5 people on a shop floor might now just take 2 people and 1 robot, meaning 3 people could be without work. And that is, that's where the anxiety is coming from. What does this mean? 4 in 10 workers are going to be affected. Am I going to lose my job? And I would concede that, there's part of me that's a little nervous about this. Wait till they come up with a robot that can do these presentations. It's not far off. So there's a part of me that, is maybe a bit apprehensive about this as well. But the rational economist in me sort of takes over and says, don't worry about this too much. Because in fact, if we look back over the last 300 years of how Western economies have evolved, this has always been the case. This is not really anything new. You go back to the Industrial Revolution. At the time, new innovations in equipment and machinery were displacing all kinds of workers. And workers at the time weren't very happy about it either. We remember the Luddites, attacking the machines with sledgehammers, or, they were upset because they were losing their jobs. And it was painful. But in the wake of those new innovations, there were always new industries that arise and new jobs that arise, jobs that didn't have names prior to that innovation coming along. But jobs that in fact did provide greater growth and diversity for the economies. And in 2018, with automation and robotics, it's really the same thing. Two differences, I would suggest. One is the speed at which all of this is happening is shocking. And in some ways, it's happening so much more quickly, the Industrial Revolution isn't even really comparable because the pace of change is so fast. That is putting a challenge and added stress or anxiety on workers that are kind of scrambling to keep up. So the pace of change is faster. The other thing I would concede is different is artificial intelligence is no longer just a machine that replaces back muscles of someone, digging a ditch. This is now potentially replacing or augmenting human imagination and human learning and thinking. What artificial intelligence can do is not really comparable to those other, innovations in the last 300 years. So there are some differences, but fundamentally, I think the story remains the same. There are going to be displacements in the workforce. There are going to be industries completely transformed by this. There are going to be surplus workers in certain industries, but new industries will invariably arise, and that will create new jobs and new opportunities. It's just always a bit awkward because they don't exist yet, so it's hard to pinpoint precisely what those jobs are going to be and where they're going to be located and what skills you're going to need for them. And this is the question, that vexes everybody. How do we train young people for jobs that don't exist yet? But that is the challenge. Why I remain very optimistic, however, about Alberta particularly, is our labor market and our population. We've got characteristics that I think will put us in very, very good position. We are a younger demographic than many other places. It's not to say medium, old age people are incapable of change. It just seems a lot easier when you're 22, to adjust and make changes. But we're all capable of change. Pardon me. So our demographic is helpful. We are a highly educated and trained and skilled population. Education levels here in Alberta, higher or at least favorable compared to a lot of other places in the country, maybe in North America or Europe. So we're highly trained and educated, but the third, and maybe the most important, is we are a very entrepreneurial-oriented labor market. And there is statistical and empirical evidence for that, by the way. It's not just one of these myths that we like to tell ourselves, how entrepreneurial we are in Alberta, because that is a bit of our collective sort of mythology, but it isn't myth. There is, in fact, statistical and empirical evidence that suggests Alberta is perhaps one of the most entrepreneurial-minded places on the planet. So those three characteristics, our demographics, our skills and education, and most of all, our entrepreneurial attitudes, I think that positions Alberta and your towns and communities and cities very well to not just survive the onslaught of automation and robotics. You don't want to just survive something. You want to thrive in that new environment. I think Alberta has every opportunity to do that. But changes in the labor market around automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence, I think, will be a fifth theme this year. So just to wrap up, our forecast for growth this year, and as I always joke, I tell this joke every year, the secret to good forecasting, revise frequently. And we do this, my team at ATB Financial, every quarter we sit down and we have a look at our model and our assumptions around economic growth, and we make any tweaks or changes if we feel it necessary. And our most recent forecast, we're now expecting growth, real GDP growth in Alberta this year, 2.8%. Now that's a moderate rate of growth, certainly better than 2 years of contraction that we saw in 15 and 16. But it's only a moderate rate of growth, and roughly half the rate of growth that we were experiencing in the first 5 years of this decade, where growth every year between 2010 and 2014 was closer to 4.5%, or 1 year it was 5.5% every year. And a lot of us in Alberta, we got really used to those fast growth rates, galloping ahead. This is Alberta, 5% growth is normal. Well, actually it's not normal, and arguably it's not healthy when all of that growth is pinned on one industry and one price in that industry, being crude oil. We paid dearly for that in the recession when our economy in those 2 years contracted by 7.5%. We came crawling out of it last year. 2018, growth resumes at a more moderate rate of growth, probably a healthier and more sustainable rate of growth. But I would add, still a rate of growth that leaves people feeling frustrated. It still feels sluggish out there. And this is my challenge as an economist as I travel around the province, because I have to sort of say the indicators are showing the economy is growing, 2.8% growth. Look at the data. But the reality runs up against what a lot of people and businesses are feeling, and that is frustration. They're still feeling it's too slow. Most businesses are saying, yeah, it's better than it was 2 years ago, but I'm barely hanging on. We need things to pick up here quick. So I would note that there is a level of frustration just because of the sluggishness of Alberta's economy. And that is, I think, a challenge maybe a lot of you are going to have to manage in your towns and communities and cities, is that feeling of business sluggishness as things in the economy are improving. They're improving, but sometimes it feels a bit slow. So with that, I will conclude. I will note, as I always do, the owl. This is our daily update every morning. Now, you guys should know this already. Why do we call it the owl? What's the significance of the great horned owl to Alberta? Oh, you guys are good at this already. It is our provincial bird, the majestic great horned owl. If any of you know anything about owls, you know they are very aware of what's going on around them. Nothing gets past an owl. They can see in the dark. They can hear a mouse moving under the snow. So we thought our provincial bird made a good symbol for our daily note, which is subtitled Focused on Alberta's Economy. Comes out every morning, takes you 60 seconds to read it. Takes me a lot longer than that to write it, just FYI. But for you, nice plain language. It's always, each morning, it's just one indicator that we're talking about. So this morning, I think Nick is writing on retail sales, but it's usually something that's hot off the press from Stats Canada that day. We think it provides a nice real-time read how Alberta's economy is progressing and evolving. So if you're interested in that, I invite you to sign up. You can go to aetb.com/economics. Best of all, it's entirely free. So with that, I want to thank you once again for inviting me out to Banff this morning for the conference. Thank you for your kind attention. I wish you a great trip home and a great rest of 2018. Do we have time, Leanne, for questions?